Good morning, everyone. I look a little familiar, but we have Orvar joining us today. We're going to be talking about evolving UX at Bungie. So that's right, I have the thing. So this is a multi-part presentation. The first part, I'm going to be defining areas of growth and kind of like the origin of where these problems maybe came from. In part two, Jenn is going to talk about kind of how we tackle these problems with team transparency and adopting Agile. And then Orvar is going to be talking about how we are going to continue evolving our UX maturity into the future and a little bit of strategies for how you can convince game designers to help you out with that process. So who am I? You guys know me a little bit, but I graduated with a bachelor's in fine arts and production animation from DigiPen Institute of Technology. I actually teach there at night. I have 8 years experience in the industry. I've shipped over a dozen titles on all kinds of different consoles, and Bungie is my 4th studio. So I have a wide breadth of experience with dealing with an immature UI UX department at different studios in different situations. So every time I switched to a team, there was always a question of how I would fit into the process. The assumption was always that I was a graphic artist, and I thought that too in the beginning, but the more projects I did, the more I realized that there was a certain perspective that was missing that I had an instinct for, and that was the UX perspective. It always took me proving to the design team that I could help them with their designs by enhancing them rather than making my own or changing them. And once I'd prove myself, then it would be fine, and then the project would be over and I'd have to do it all over again. So where does this problem come from? If we kind of understand the origin of this problem, then we're going to have a better shot at maybe overcoming this challenge. And there are a few really good reasons why I think the game industry has this problem with adopting UX design. So we already had designers. Several speakers have made that point already. But since we already had people in the design role thinking about designing the product, there wasn't really an obvious need to create our own designers like there is in other non-game fields where they didn't have designers. So like in web design, you know, engineers and artists are making things and they're like, we should have someone design this stuff for us. And thus the UX designer was born, where in game design, we already had the game designers. We had people who could do UX, except when we didn't. So some game designers do have a good instinct for UX design and would naturally do that as a part of their game design process. But you don't necessarily have to be a good UX designer, obviously, to be a good game designer. And sometimes, like in the case with me, your graphic artist is the one who has good UX design skills. And so that person could cover that hole. The problem is, it's an invisible skill, so you don't know when you're missing that skill set, and that can be really bad to find out in the middle of a project. Also, in the beginning, game teams and games themselves were a lot smaller and simpler, so it was fine for a bunch of people, for the small team, to wear lots of different hats. So it was fine to have the UX design responsibilities kind of be parsed out amongst those who had that skill set. But now with games as big as they are, we cannot rely on people picking up that design. We also used to not be very good at looking outside our industry, and I think that's changing, and I'm really encouraged to see a bunch of talks already talk about this, looking outside of games for inspiration. But I think we were trying to find our identity as an industry since we were so young, and so we were very focused on looking inward and developing our own processes that are unique to games, right when UX design was like taking off in other industries. So I feel like we missed it because we were busy just trying to sort ourselves out without trying to integrate this new thing into our process. So since everyone's experience is so different with UX designers, and students are only just starting to really have a presence, having academically learned about this stuff, There is no standard about a UX designer's skill set, philosophy, or terminology. This means that even people who are experienced with working with one UX designer might have different expectations for a different UX designer who comes from a different background and talks about things differently and goes about things differently, because we didn't all like go through school and have like agreed upon methods. That's slowly changing. So this is a list of the diverse set of backgrounds the members of our own team have. We come from all over the map, from the most artsy artists to straight up engineers. So lots of different skills. So we're all familiar with having too many cooks in the kitchen, right? When it comes to design, design by committee, all that. The opposite problem I find is true, and I'm sure many of you experience this. In UI, oftentimes we're understaffed, right? So the key is having the right size team with the right skills. So in my smallest studio experiences, I did all the UX design, all the UI art, all the implementation for multiple projects, and the expectation was a one-woman UI team. Which was awesome and exciting, but it's a lot. In typical cooks in the kitchen metaphor, you only need to cook in one kitchen, and you're delivering a meal for a family of 4. It's doable. You can do it, you can cook everything, you're good. When the feature gets bigger and you start needing more members of your team in like a mid-sized studio, you can expect everyone to be able to do any of the jobs like in a fast food restaurant, but you're able to handle the volume that's needed. You start to need a bigger team, and it's fine to have generalists at this stage. But when you get up to a big AAA project, like at Bungie or maybe your games, with such a large team and such a high quality bar and such a vast product, the expectations become very different. You can't keep the one person does it all mindset. You need a big team of people with many different strengths who deeply specialize in a few areas, like in a gourmet kitchen, with chefs who dedicate their time to mastering a specific type of dish, who are coordinated by the executive chef, so that we're not all bumping into each other and spilling boiling water on each other, right? So the other advantage to thinking of your team as a group of specialists who have their area is that you can avoid having people wear too many hats. So when you're in the one person does it all mindset and you scale up to a AAA project like at Bungie, you encounter several problems. And so on the left is an image of a screen we call the director. It's very beautiful. It's our like big hero screen. It's got lots of fancy animations, that kind of thing. And on the right is an image of the some of the tech that goes into making the director functional. And one of my coworkers who's here today described the screen on the right as being like a cross stitch, where it's beautiful on the front, and then you look on the back and it's this mess of threads. And I thought that metaphor was perfect for how our tool set works. We used to expect people to be able to do both of these deliverables. And as you can imagine, that is challenging, to say the least. So some of the problem with too many hats is that you have to context switch a lot. Just like we're concerned about player cognition load, we should be worried about dev cognition load as well. So every time we ask someone to switch context, we're taxing their mental energy. You're also looking at a design through different lenses all the time when you're switching context. And there's a reason we have different disciplines in design in the first place. Some individuals might be amazing at switching lenses quickly and are equally good at using different lenses, but most of us have biases and favor one lens over another. And sometimes it can be really hard to switch a perspective, switch a lens really quickly. For me, sometimes it takes me a while to be able to be like, no, let me like rewire my brain here for a second to be able to think of this from a different perspective. Most importantly, you aren't going to be getting the best ideas if one person is wearing all the hats, although my daughter makes it look really cute. And this idea is important, so we're going to drill down into it. You aren't going to get the best ideas for several reasons. If you only have one person looking at a problem from one perspective with one set of eyes, they are going to miss things. It doesn't matter how good they are. The more eyes on the problem, looking at it from different angles, the better chance you are going to be at catching design problems, bugs, you name it. As much as an individual can try, it's very hard to come up with several equally good opposing ideas and allowing them to battle it out in your brain without any external input. If you're missing out on that clash of ideas, you're losing that proving ground where ideas are refined and melded together and made better. It's the tension between different ideas where great UX design and great game design come from. As individuals, we each have different problem sets that inspire us and other problem sets that we're maybe a little less interested in. Even the best designers play favorites. If we allow people to wear the hats they prefer to wear, as opposed to forcing them into solving problems that they have less passion for, we're going to get happier designers who are going to make better designs because of it. Our differences make us great, and that's what allows us to make the best experiences for our players. The first steps to a great team is happy team members, and if we change our mindsets for individuals on these large AAA teams, we're a good chunk of the way there. Now I'm going to pass it off to Jen, who's going to talk about how these problems manifested themselves at Bungie and how we combated them.
Hello, my name is Jennifer Ash. To give a little bit of background on me, I've been in the UX industry for about 10 years now. My background, I got a dual degree in games and simulations and psychology with a focus on HCI. I was the first graduate of my program, so games is really young. Like Jami mentioned, we're a young industry, and this is definitely the case as I've experienced it. For example, there wasn't a UX design position really in games, so my first job was actually working on mainframes at IBM on the System Z program, mainframes. So the big ones that the banks use, healthcare use, I tried to make that experience better for the people who use them, so completely separated from games. But I then went back and got my master's degree in digital media design for learning, so that was how games and education and learning intersect rather. And then I started at Bungie in 2012 as a user researcher, and then moved over to the UI team as a UI designer in 2015. I also adjunct teach at DigiPenn Institute of Technology in the evenings, mostly teaching UR like I spoke about yesterday. So the next thing I wanted to cover was transparency across teams. So we had a number of process changes over the last 3 years to try and combat transparency issues of design. When I first joined the team, these were the roles that we had. So we had UI design, UI art, engineering, UI tech art, test, and production. All of us worked together on one large team to develop features. We also worked in the waterfall methodology. So that meant typically how a feature was built was production would come to us from a different team. They would give us the feature outlines, and then the UI designer would figure out what are the goals, what's the requirements that that design team has for us to implement. We go through the process of figuring out a spec, mock-ups, wireframes, mid-level wireframes. So then it would get passed to UI art. UI art would take a pass making high fidelity, what are the images that go into the game, and then that would get put to UI tech art, who would then implement it into the game. Engineering usually actually started about in the UI design phase, because usually the designer would work with them to figure out what backend do we need to get set up, but ultimately their work would get implemented at the UI tech art phase of the game. It would move to test, and then it would be shipped out the door. What you can notice about this diagram is that there's not a lot of upward motion on this. So designs would go down the process, and a lot of times the designer wouldn't see what happened until it made it into the game, and you're seeing it there for the first time, or the artist would see it too at the same time. So there wasn't a lot. Ideally, there would be communication, but there wasn't a lot in the process due to short timelines and just trying to get features out the door. So what you see here is kind of an example of a schedule that we would have in Waterfall to just get a better idea about what we mean by how features would get implemented or not make it. So for example, feature 1, UI designer gets started on it, spends some time on it. It then gets passed to visual art. Engineering, as you can see, has started on it at the design phase, and then it gets passed to tech art, it gets implemented, moves on to feature 2. Now, as you can see, things can get mixed up due to if someone starts work on something earlier. So say the UI artist maybe has a feature that takes longer, but doesn't need a lot of design, it just needs to be implemented. So they can get started on that sooner, but then the schedule is all off now. We now have features that aren't getting shipped. Like, for example, feature 3 there. UI design worked on it fairly early, but art didn't get to it till much later, and now it's not even in the game because tech art wasn't able to implement it. So there are problems with this process. One example of how we use the waterfall method to ship a feature was the player state display for PvP. So what this feature was that Sandbox and PvP came to us with a request. They wanted to add an element to the HUD for competitive gaming to make it clear to the player where players died, what their super was. So their super is like a special class ability that's kind of like an ultimate in other games. They wanted to know, was the super available? Was it being used, and which one? And then we also wanted to combine the information on that screen so it was clearer to the player. They didn't have to look in 2 places. So a lot of the scoreboard information that was already on the screen was moved up to this location. There was a lot of exploration on the design side to make this feature. So, for example, one of the first questions that we had was, where does it live? There's a lot of information we're trying to convey. And so we did a lot of experimentation and worked with the team to figure out where. So, for example, we first explored, what if it's on the bottom of the screen? Well, Sandbox had no go for that because they are in charge of weapons and how the game feels, and that interferes with your weapon completely if it's along the bottom. Plus, the weapon already conveys information. You've got your ammo counter on the weapon a lot of times, so that was a conflict. The left side was completely out because we have our objectives, our motion tracker, a bunch of information already lives there, so it couldn't go there. So the options were on the right or at the top. On the right, it's not really as natural for the player to look at because they're already used to looking at the health bar, which is along the top center. So we tried this, we moved it to the top. Now, we were actually able to get content to get to this feature first, so they were able to implement a prototype early on using assets that we had. So we were able to see, how did it work? Is it effective? Do people look at it? Is this something that we want to move forward with early on the process? However, art didn't get a chance to look at this yet. So when they saw it for the first time, they were like, oh, there's a lot more elements we want to add, maybe change the layout a little bit, but we're getting really close to ship at this point, which is not an ideal time to make any major changes. So there were a lot of quick conversations, a lot of quick iterations, and overall, yes, we shipped the feature. Yes, it was good, but internally as a team, it was not successful, nor did it really feel good for us collaborating. So what are we doing to try to combat that? So we moved to Agile a little while ago. This is an example of how we've split the team. So instead of having one large team with all the roles, we now have small teams. So the small team is comprised of one of each of the different disciplines. So now we have UX design, visual design, engineering, UI tech design, test, and production. You'll notice there's small circles on the bottom of 2 of these roles, the PO and the SM. So PO is the product owner, and the SM is the Scrum Master in Agile terms. I'll go over the product owner in a little bit, but that's how on our team that we split those Agile roles amongst the disciplines. So one of the rituals that really helped us expose transparency on the team, so like before I mentioned, it was really hard to see what features, what people were working on, and things like that. Having planning day helped all the disciplines understand better how things were going to work out. So we would all meet, all the disciplines for a release would meet in like a giant ballroom and go over the features that they wanted to ship for that particular release. We would then break it into all the features into different sprints to understand when could we get to these features, could we ship them within the time period. A sprint is typically about 2 weeks. So this is about a month and a half, 2 months of planning that we're doing in one meeting. But it really helped us expose, do we have time? What are we actually creating? It gave exposure to how much we were already producing, because a lot of times teams wouldn't understand, why isn't my feature being included in the game? And a lot of it was, well, we've got a lot of other teams requesting things as well, and we're balancing the priorities. So this allowed us to have conversations about balancing those priorities. It also exposed any dependencies on other teams. So if we needed code from another game discipline, we could let them know early so that they could schedule that earlier in their schedule, so it could be a nice flow of information across. And it also addressed any risks or open questions that we had. So overall, it just opened up the conversations that we were going to have regarding the features we're shipping, and that helped a lot. Also, all the teams determined what would be needed to complete a piece of work. So everyone on the team was on board now with how are we going to address this? What are possible solutions for it? We'll decide the details later, but this allowed for everyone to be on board with what we were creating. Another ritual is sprint planning. So you can see here, this is just an example of planning out maybe 2 sprints, very, very theoretical. But so you have 2 features. We usually break them down into 4 different types of tasks or user stories. We have the spike, which typically gets added to the UX designer because it's figuring out the goals, what direction we're going to work ahead, what are the teams we're working with, putting it all in documentation. There's the code, the engineering work that needs to get done in order for it to be implemented. There's the content, which is usually the tech designer's role to implement the feature, and the visual, which is more what was previously the visual artist, is now the visual designer. So as you can see, everything looks nice. Every feature is getting once per sprint, great. But that's not how things work, right? So it was really easy for us then in this situation to be like, all right, we managed to complete these tasks in sprint 1, but we need to move another part of it over to sprint 2. Now let's have a conversation. What do we need to do to make the other features fit into the rest of the sprints that we're going to have? So it was an easy way for us to determine were things going long, were things on schedule, could we bring things forward? It allowed an open conversation as to the development process within the small teams themselves. And if we had to, we could bubble it up to other related teams. Another aspect that we used in Agile was being co-located. So each small team was sat together pretty much as near as possible. And that really helped with the communication because a lot of times people wouldn't know who to come talk to on a team, and that was difficult to communicate across different disciplines. So they knew they had to talk to the product owner in the Agile world, but also a lot of times the UX designer was controlling's a little strong. They were writing down the documentation and making sure that all the goals were understood. And so who do you talk to? Is it the PO or is it the UX designer? And so we sat next to each other. So it was really easy for example, on clans when we worked together, a designer would come over, stand right between us, and be like, I have a question, and we let us know what it is. And that was really useful because they no longer have to worry, are they playing telephone? Are they talking to the right person? Do they have to come back later and convey the same information? They knew we were on the same team. It was also very useful for the other disciplines on the team to overhear conversations, be like, actually, that's not how that would work. Let me tell you more, and be involved with the conversations. And just having that osmotic communication across teams really helped a lot. So sitting next to each other was very useful in developing some of our features. So as I mentioned, I was going to go over how we split the role of product owner. So our product owner was our tech designer. And what the product owner does by definition is they hold the vision for the product, they represent the business and the end users, they own the product, they prioritize the stories, but they are not involved with how it's actually implemented. That's up to the team. So on our team, the UX designer and the PO were separate roles, which isn't always true. But I wanted to give an example of how we used those roles individually to work together. So the example is the emote interface. Now this was a request by the players for years. Originally, players could only equip one emote custom. The other 3 were dedicated to a D-pad direction on your controller. I'm going to, for simplicity, refer to the console controls for the moment being. So you've got for our team, our small team created the emote interface. So my role as UX designer, I put a bunch of designs on the table, just threw out different interactions that we wanted to have, different ways it would show up, different ways to preview, and then we put it in front of the team. We narrowed it down to 2, and then we ended up going forward with one of the designs, and this is where it ended up. So we had the emotes that you all own on the left, and then the ones you have assigned on the right. But late in the process, once we had it mostly implemented, I should say, we got some feedback that the interaction model could be changed and maybe should be. And so what the suggestion was is that you select, so originally what we had is you hovered over an emote on the left and you press the D-pad direction and it would just slot it into that spot. What we got feedback on was you should instead click on the D-pad emote and then click on another one to assign it. So that way there was kind of a 2-step process, a confirmation process. We didn't completely agree, so our reaction was, let's user test it, or let's find out. But because we were on a small team working together, engineering started exploring immediately, can we make this possible? What can we actually do within our time frame based upon how it's already completed? And our content creator, our tech designer, also started working on how can we maybe have a solution just within content to solve the problem. As UX designer, we had already done some prototyping early on to figure out the interactions. So I worked with our user research contact at the time to figure out how can we figure out which method is objectively better. So we ran an internal usability study. So we had the A/B testing. We had 2 different models. We were able to prototype it roughly in the game engine itself. And so we put it in front of people, and as I was getting the results, engineering and content were coming close to their investigations, and they found out they can actually do the compromise. You can click on it to turn it into assign mode, and if you're hovering over it, press the D-pad, and if you can also go over and assign it. So either method that we got feedback on worked, which was great. The other good result was that basically supported the UR. The UR results basically supported it as well. So that was a good confirmation to get before we shipped a feature. But everyone on the team worked together to figure out what was the best solution within a very short amount of time, and we were able to utilize our roles effectively to branch out the different work that we had. So recently, as of April, I became the PO of the team, and I just wanted to go over some of the changes that we noticed based upon the role shift. So one of the changes is that there's now a consistent feature owner. So people don't have to figure out, do I talk to the UX designer or do I talk to the PO? It's one person, there's no game of telephone. The other thing, though, is that there's not enough time in the day for a PO and a UX designer to develop all the specs necessary. So, which is actually great, is that spec development kind of gets spread across the different roles. So maybe all the edge cases aren't caught. Maybe that's something that the team identifies and goes, maybe we should, is this a problem? And we have a conversation early on of UX decisions and things like that. So it helps kind of bring everyone together. The next thing I wanted to talk about was what's in a name? What's the difference between UI and UX? There's always been a discussion as to what's the correct term, what does it mean? So I want to go over a little bit of the background of that. So at GDC 16 was the first time I went with my UI designer title on my badge. It was really interesting because whenever I went up to someone with that title, they were like, oh, so you do graphic arts? And I'm like, no, you don't want my art in the game. That is not my skill set. I come from cognitive science. Trust me, it's better that way. So I tried an experiment. Throughout the week, I changed my title when I introduced myself and changed it to UI UX designer. And it was amazing how much people understood that role. They were like, oh, so you do the interactions and the wireframes? Like, yes, that's it. So unofficially changed my title to be UI UX design. But recently, as Orvar is going to go over in more detail, the department's shifted roles in general. So we've all moved. Before, I was the only designer. I was the only person on the content creation team that was in the design department. Everyone else is in the art department. So there's a weird kind of divide. Recently we moved, so we're all within the design department, which aligns better with what our roles actually are at the company. So these are the roles in general. So UI designer became UX designer, UI artist became visual designer, and tech artist became tech designer. And Orvar is going to go in more details as to what that means. But it really helped clarify what each role primarily does and what they can help you with. One thing that I was able to do as a dedicated UX designer on the team was UX reviews. So what are they? In our terms, what they are is basically I, as the UX designer, would meet with a gameplay designer when there's a feature, particularly one that has no UI design. And I would run through the different user flows that they were expecting and determine, are there any concerns from a UI standpoint? Are there any concerns from a UX standpoint? And bring it back to the team as to here's what they're proposing they're going to deliver. Are there any concerns over this feature being shipped? So it was a really good way to expose different things before they got into the game themselves. It allowed us to call out issues. It allowed us to help other gameplay disciplines, not just hack it in. We were able to actually find solutions a lot of times. It also allowed us to take some of the gameplay design, offload the details, implementation details, and allow them to focus on their strength, the experience that they want to have, because we would take on the how do you present it in the game and what sort of ways can you present it in the game. So that was really useful. It forced us to have a systematic thinking of the feature, so not just looking at how does it display, but what are you trying to accomplish and does this system scale? And it also really helped build trust across the disciplines, because before a lot of times we didn't have time, they would just try to make it work with what they had existing, and that wasn't an ideal player experience often. So this allowed us to address it early and also have conversations early and show them our value in what we could provide their designs to make it work in the game. One example of this is Exotic Masterworks. So we shipped the Masterworks feature earlier in the year. It was a long-tail pursuit for players to build up their armor and their armor. And so the original aspect of it was you would get this item on the bottom and you would slot it into the spot, and it would make your item a masterwork. It would upgrade it. But we wanted to make it for exotic special. So there were different steps and different states that the player would have to address, different objectives on the plug items that are the lower ones, in order to accomplish this. Now, our tooltips for those plug items didn't support objectives at all. Like, there were different things that the tooltip was not made for originally when we made this feature. So I worked with the design discipline the gameplay discipline in order to make this feature work. I broke it down step by step. What would you see in the tooltip? What would you see in the details screen? What do we need to add to the tooltip in order to make it workable for them to ship this feature? So also looked at what do you have in your system, like the investment designed system, in order to ship this feature. So it was an interesting collaboration between two very complex systems to implement to make a feature that was clear to the user in the end instead of being confusing as to how to accomplish something. So overall, it was a very positive experience. We were able to clearly define on a spec as to what we expected in the game, and then the gameplay designer could take a very abstract system and make sure it was implemented in the correct method, so there wasn't any surprises for either team in the end. So I just want to cover really quick what we've seen as some of the benefits of having a UX designer, UX discipline and a UX design role. We're able to assist with building more sustainable and scalable solutions to complex and abstract systems. I mentioned investment and sandbox. These are both game feel. They're how the economy works, things like that. These aren't systems that you can see unless they're exposed through the UI. So we can work with those designers to better identify how do we make this work long term, because often the solution is, we'll just fix it now and we'll worry about it later. You don't want that. You want to be able to solve it at the moment so you have a system that you can use. We also could identify UI functionality across disciplines. A lot of times disciplines would request a feature, and they wouldn't understand that another discipline requested a very similar feature, and maybe they could overlap and use the systems that were within the game already. By interacting with UX early, we help identify and prioritize changes to systems and kind of offload some of the design burden. They don't have to figure out, how would this work in the UI? It's like, no, just come to us. We'll work with you. We'll make sure that it works. Or we'll identify ways that you can make it work. We also maintain consistency and player expectations across the game, because it's really easy to go figure out some way that works, but the player has now multitudes of different methods, and so now how do we make this consistent? We can identify those early and make sure everyone stays on the same page. And we also enable gameplay disciplines to have their best work shine, because ultimately that's our goal, that's their goal. Everyone's goal is just to make the best player experience possible. So that's one way that we can help them. I'm going to hand it over to Orvar, who's going to talk about how the department has developed over time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Orvar. Let's see if this works. So I lead the UI UX org at Bungie. I'm originally from Iceland, but I live now in Bellevue in Washington State, where I'm working on the Destiny franchise with the UI UX org. And I'm delighted to talk to you today about two things close to my heart. So the first thing is the ongoing path to UX maturity at Bungie. And the second topic is about working effectively with game designers. So let's dive directly into the first topic, our ongoing journey of UX maturity at Bungie. How has it evolved? Where are we at today? And what do we believe the future holds? In 2017, a studio survey went out to all teams at the studio and asked us about job satisfaction and fulfillment. It used one of our company values as its key message: teams are stronger than heroes, to call attention to the fact that Bungie cares deeply about team health. We noticed that the responses from my team, referred to as the UI team at the time, indicated that improvements needed to be made to ensure a healthy and high-performing team. Unpacking the feedback with the team uncovered that the team wanted clearly defined roles and responsibilities to ensure alignment with leadership on what was expected of them. There we go. The team felt like a service team, not included in design discussions with other design teams early or frequently enough. There we go. And the team felt that it was not included in high-level strategic and creative discussions where important decisions got made. So we made 5 key changes to our org in our efforts to improve this. The first one is we redefined our branding within the studio, and we now refer to it as the UI UX org instead of just the UI team. This helps clarify the fact that we have more than just one team. We have multiple agile teams within the org. It also calls attention to the fact that the team focuses on UX in addition to UI to incentivize stakeholders to seek us out earlier in the design process. We moved all creative roles to the design discipline to ensure a closer relationship with other designers at the studio and to further help ensure we would become part of the early design explorations. This clicker is going to be fun. I can just feel it. We established 3 roles, all with design titles, to emphasize the core design intent of our creative roles and defined job profiles with clear definitions of responsibilities and capabilities for those roles. We defined a design process unique to our org, while also sharing the design principles of the broader design discipline. And we aligned with leadership on a clear path of creative direction from both art and design. So let's dive into some of these changes in more detail. Our design roles. UX designers seek to understand user needs and design intent and collaborate closely with creative leads to ensure a good user experience. Visual designers produce the final visual representation of a UI experience, do UI comps, and all graphical assets and icons. And technical designers build complete functioning and interactive UI experiences using our proprietary UI tools. All of our technical designers used to be called tech artists. We found this to be confusing because the definition of tech artists in other teams within the studio did not match what our content creators were doing in their role. We wanted to ensure the name matched what the core responsibility and purpose of the role was. It was important to call them designers rather than artists, to call attention to the fact that they focus strongly on design intent in their role. Role definition for our 3 design roles. We focused each role on a specific core area, which is the primary function of that role, along with a secondary focus, which is about a quarter of the role. The UX designer is primarily a core design role, with content creation as a secondary focus. The visual designer focused primarily on graphic design and creating 2D assets, but might also do some content creation within our tools to tweak assets at the end within the client area. And the tech designer focuses on implementation in all phases, making UI screens fully functional with animations and feedback indicators and hooking up all necessary data components. Their secondary focus is on generic design, where they utilize their technical insights and expertise in design discussions. For Bungie, delegating these areas between these roles helped each designer focus their craft and grow in their core areas. Before we had this separation, we would have members of the team who might be doing all 3 things. And like Jami mentioned before, this made it very hard for them to truly develop their craft or fulfill all the necessary steps each area requires to ensure a good overall quality. While a single person could flesh out the initial design specs, create assets, and do implementation, they can't be in all necessary conversations, maintain all style guides, design guidelines, produce documentation, mentor others, conduct design reviews, presentations, playtests, build strong, sustainable, and easily comprehensible content. For a single person, being required to do all of this would be overwhelming and would affect quality. We also found that separating the designer roles into these 3 specific roles made it more effective for us to fill open positions, as it would more clearly describe what qualifications a candidate needed to have. If we are looking for a visual designer, we need someone with an extremely strong grasp of graphic design and at least 3 years professional experience in that specific area. The same goes for a UX designer. We would want someone with 3 years experience doing UX design specifically. For the tech designer, we would want someone who can build functional prototypes quickly, has done 3 years of final implementation of complex UI screens, knows scripting, and can directly collaborate with engineers. If we had to hire generalists who could do all these 3 things in one role, we would need someone with 9 years experience, not 3, because we see the necessary experience for each of these 3 fields as individual knowledge areas. One of the primary things we needed to ensure in our efforts was to make sure visual designers would get direction from both art directors and design directors because of the importance of both upholding the art quality bar as well as meeting design goals for the game UI. So we established the visual design lead role. Visual designers would get creative direction directly from art directors and from design directors through the UI UX director. Any creative alignment issues between those directors would get bubbled up to the game director. We changed the role of UI artists to visual designers. This change might not be perfect for everyone. There are certainly individuals within our industry today who are called UI artists and are very happy with that title. They might want to identify themselves as artists primarily and might have career goals towards art leadership roles. We talked these things through on our end to ensure buy-in and alignment from the team, and especially those affected directly. In the end, we collectively agreed that it would be in our interest to become part of the design org, to ensure we could become part of the broader design process and stop being perceived solely as an art service team. We also ensured that our visual designers would still be able to maintain direct ties with the art org in various art-focused meetings to keep improving their craft abilities and to share knowledge and methods with others in the art discipline. In addition to having visual design lead, we want to further delegate leadership within our org. And we want to establish a UX design lead and a tech design lead into our org. We are actively working towards this goal. Another key change we did was defining a design process unique to our org. We follow a common 5-phase process, each with a clear purpose. We make sure we always follow the process, no matter how big or small a feature or task is. As we get to the last phases, it is normal to go through some of the iterative cycles between the last 3 phases. But rarely do we need to go back to discovering problems or redefining the design, unless the broader project vision has pivoted and project goals have changed drastically. The tasks we list under our process are the kinds of things we might do in each phase, like producing a vision, creative briefs, design specs, and various evaluations and research. We don't do all of these tasks all the time. We use the ones we believe will help solve the problems we want to fulfill and the goals the project leadership has defined. What we use and how extensively we use it comes down to scope, timeline, and resources. While we might have specific deliverables attached to specific roles to clarify who is accountable for ensuring it gets done, working on each of these tasks within each phase is seen as a collective team effort. We embrace creative discussions between all the different design roles, as well as other disciplines, like engineers, QA, and producers. So what is our future vision in terms of the UX maturity? We will continue to improve our org through trial and error and to communicate our methods and practices on a regular basis to the studio at large. We will seek out help from people within the studio to champion UX as a dedicated craft and a dedicated org within the studio. We can't do it alone. We will move all teams within the UI UX org into the same development org where all game designers reside, and work closely with them on gameplay experiences based on a long-term vision for all features and releases. We will ensure the perspective and value of UX design gets a seat at the table within strategy groups at Bungie, where overall business and product strategy is defined. Moving from art to design was a great step in the right direction. Next step in our evolution is to form a true UX discipline which sits alongside other core disciplines in the studio like art and design. Now I'm going to talk about my second topic, which is working with game designers. I have found UX design to have different meanings depending on what gaming studio you belong to, and Bungie struggles with this as well. At Bungie, it means designing the experience of interacting with a UI in our game. This might be more narrow of a definition than we would like it to be, but I have found it to be important to accept and acknowledge where we are at in our path to UX maturity, so that we know what is needed to keep moving forward. When the generic term UX first emerged in the 1990s, it was meant to apply to the whole experience people have with product systems or services. This definition works really well in industries where people focusing on UX are the primary product designers. As game developers who are making entertainment, our definition of UX might need to be more specific than in other product design industries. If you are doing UX design in a company that isn't making games, you might not have other designers. You are the core designer making the overall product design. This gets a bit more tricky within the gaming industry, where the role of game designers already exists, who have been designing the overall gameplay experience long before UX had even been established. I have found it to be valuable to make a distinction between user experience and player experience when collaborating with game designers specifically. UX relates to the experience the user has with the UI, whereas player experience is the broader term used to describe the overall gameplay experience. Players' emotions, motivations, engagement, immersion, enjoyment, perception. The overall success of our work relies on those factors as well, of course, but they are not the core focus or responsibility of UX designers at Bungie. To complete the graph of the overall experiential ecosystem, as I call this, we also have to have the customer experience, which focuses on the overall experience our customers have with all of our products and services combined. I've used this method of separating these terms in conversations to call attention to the fact that each of these areas can have different set of goals, design methods, craft expertise, and ownership. While they can share a common set of principles and vision, they deviate in important ways. This breakdown might not be how many UX practitioners within the gaming industry define game UX. It seems to separate it from its initial broader definition, which states that it covers all experiences, no matter if you are defined as a user, a player, or a customer. While I'm not advocating for changing the definition of game UX, the reason I want to bring this idea forth is because this has proven to be very effective when working closely with game designers and building relationships with various stakeholders within a large studio. It helps clarify roles, get alignment, and increase effective collaboration. When people realize you're not trying to take over their area, they are much more open to collaborating with you. It can be helpful to use user experience and player experience as separate terms to clear up confusion, making a clear distinction between the two design roles and identify who is responsible for the vision and strategy for each. It helps clarify that UX design is a specific expertise and uses a specific process. That becomes clearer if we refer to these areas as separate terms. And this has helped me strengthen relationships with game directors and design directors, giving everyone a clear term to refer to in our daily interactions. When working with game designers, it is helpful to think globally in gameplay experience terms during our collaboration. While we are representing UX in these conversations, we are more effective if we do it through the same lens game designers evaluate things through, the player experience. I have made the mistake in the past of trying to force UX design methods and ideology into the game design process to prove its value. Not all designers are comfortable using UX tools and methods to flesh out their designs. It is great and magical when a game designer is willing to go into a room with you and do a user journey, but we should also be willing to work with them in ways that they feel comfortable. Some game designers, or even game directors and design directors, function better when collaborating in a very relaxed, unstructured conversation style setting. Our goal is not just to fulfill the needs of the user, we should also measure success by how effective and enjoyable our collaboration with game designers is. The best result is when game designers feel their product is better because of the direct involvement of UX practitioners and that they are able to make better decisions and solve problems faster by involving us from the beginning. The ultimate goal is to have game designers be the ones strongly advocating for having UX be part of the design throughout the whole development cycle. Asking for goals when game designers provide a solution, something we've probably all experienced. While we want to follow a proper design process and have game designers work with us on a high-level strategy and goals before diving into detailed proposals on how the UI should look or where it should be located, we also need to be willing to gather insights from the game designers in their preferred method of working. When working with game designers who are not receptive to following a specific process, scientific approach, or even data-informed problem solving, shocking, use their preferred method of collaboration. Seek out the information you need to use those methods for your deliverables. We don't always need game designers to upfront agree with our methods. We just need to show that our collaboration and joint effort resulted in a good end result. Once they see how things come together, they will seek you out again. And over time, we'll start advocating for your methods and approaches, and we'll see the value of bringing a problem to you before any solution has been formalized, so that you can solve the problem together. Thank you. All right, we have plenty of time.
Hello. It was a great talk, and I really like the perspective of how a UX designer should approach a game designer. And one thing that in our studio that we're kind of struggling with, or I'm struggling with, is I have an idea. I suppose, say, an FTUE. And I go back to the drawing board, I cook up like a prototype of a whole thing, and I just want to know like how much I am stepping into their domain, or where should I stop? I'm a game designer, by the way, and so yeah, sorry, I'm a little nervous.
Oh, you're fine, don't worry.
So you're thinking about how do you basically bring someone into that room and kind of just start collaborating with them instead of having everyone kind of like do their roles separately?
Yeah, I mean, like where should I stop? Like, should I tell them, okay, I want this animation to be looking like that? Or should I just say, hey, I want this interaction and think of it, you know?
Yeah, I would definitely not describe the specific thing. Although I was saying in the cases where people only can do that, the UX designers sometimes have to try to convert that into a goal. But if you describe a problem without really talking about a solution, you can work with that person to figure out what the solution might be. And that could be more helpful because then they understand where you're coming from. They understand why you need to solve this problem or why you need to create this experience or have this good idea. Just describe the idea itself as you would when you were basically just playing the game as a user or as a player. Just describe it that way. And then they will know how to kind of like add the things that need to get added or where it should be or how it should function and those type of things.
But in the past, just if you really cannot think of a way of describing it without being prescriptive in your solution, just be upfront like, look, this may not be the best way, but this is how I understand it to be. You're welcome to change it, but this is what I came up with. And they might look at it and be like, yeah, that's really good. We'll just do that, and I'll just polish it up. So, but just let them know that this is how you're communicating with them, but you're not being prescriptive.
Okay.
Yeah. So there's a term that I didn't learn until I joined Bungie called strawman, and it's a way to like say politely that you're not really suggesting a thing. You just want to say something so that it can actually make someone else come up with a better idea.
Yeah.
So you're like, hey, here's a strawman, and so everyone understands that that means I'm totally not suggesting this. I actually hope this is not the end result, but I want to say something, and then hopefully someone else will have a different idea.
Okay, that helps. That helps. Thank you.
Thanks for asking.
Should we go?
Yeah. And then we'll just stay over there.
Yeah, actually, first for you. First, you mentioned during the process that you are creating ideas, you brought up a bunch of ideas, and then it spread, and then you have this conversation with the team. Would like to know more details about that, but like just a general note, like it's so good actually when you're describing the process. It's so good when we actually can do that. And I also agree that being a PO is by far, in my opinion, the best way to make sure that we have the whole experience done, everything from the beginning to the end. But it's always tricky for me, like to know how can I involve more people without stop their work and You know, they really want to be there, but at the same time, I don't want anyone to say to me like, "Oh, Ty, you were wasting people's time." And how do you do that? Thank you.
We are definitely addressing that. So totally on board with that. That makes absolute sense. I think the thing that we're still working through is like depending upon the feature, it depends upon how much you involve the rest of the group, because a lot of times like tweak the thing. Well, we don't need to have a large conversation about how to tweak something or like add a different small aspect into it. But when coming to feature development, usually the goal is to think about it early. And I think as a team, you need to remind each other like, all right, we're at this phase, like, what are you doing? Or like, hey, I saw the spec that you made, and hey, could I give you some feedback? Or like, just feel the need, because like as a UX designer, I always want to hear feedback. And just because I don't ask doesn't mean I don't want it. So I think just making that clear, that that's a goal, that the whole team should be involved. And if you see something, say something sort of a thing, is important just to build into the culture. Or you hear something. Something is huge.
Sit next to each other, because she'll be having a conversation with the game designer, and they'll be talking about something like, I'm not sure how to solve this, and I'll be like, with my rolling turn,
Yeah.
hey,
Yeah.
we can do it this way.
Yeah. Or vice versa. We're gonna do this thing. It's like, what are you doing?
What are you doing?
Like, really? Like, so there's that. Having that open conversation is really important. It's hard to build. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, it's super difficult to build that kind of like rapport and just like being in the right spot. And does your company allow for that space to happen? Like, it's difficult finding seating charts. Like, all right, we're going way too deep into details of that now. But like, yeah, it's just important to build that process of like, all right, I've written up, like the user reviews were really important to determine, like, it's almost like a user journey, but basically you walk through, like, type something up about, here's what I know this team is doing now. Concerns, and then you just get that conversation started. It's a conversation starter, and just the more you can have that, the better. It is hard. It is something that everyone consciously needs to be aware of, like, hey, I don't feel like I was very aware, because it's unconscious sometimes when that shift happens, or it depends upon the development cycle too, is a big part of that shift, and you're all on the same page most of the time. It's just no one actually talked to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, and if the team is all working on different things, because it's like, we used to be this centralized UI team that would kind of like take everything from all directions. And so individual team members were doing different things. And at stand-up, everyone's like, I'm doing this, which is like completely different from everyone else. It's hard to have like every individual want to bring everyone else into their conversation, because it's going to be all this context switching. So if there's better focus and the whole team is working on the same thing, then it's almost always valuable for the whole group to be part of those discussions, because it'll be related to the things that they're actually working on.
So, yes.
Hi, so this question is, I guess, for all of you. This question was based off of a very brief Twitter exchange I just had about screaming. So we talk about like redefining the roles to make it more clear for everybody. You know, when you go to, like you said, when you go to GDC, you get a different reaction with different titles on your card. Mm-hmm. And like, I work at Ubisoft, and when I was in Montreal, I was a graphic designer, and in Toronto, I'm a UI artist on paper. So my question is kind of more of an open thing, but like, we all have talked about, you know, we'd like to really make clear what our roles are so everybody knows what it is. You go to GDC, someone says they're a level designer, cool. But like, do you think we should have like a standardized way to label ourselves, or do you think we should keep it open? Because if we do keep it open, like from project to project, team to team, studio to studio, it seems to always be recreated from scratch. Yes. And it's frustrating. But then at the same time, we are such adaptive people, and our roles do involve different things depending on the project. So do you think it should stay that way, or should we push for a more like standardized idea so it becomes more easy to like get other people on board with us?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Like, for us, it was more to try to invoke a better internal culture. But then one of the things that came out of it that we realized is that it was actually better to recruit. Like, we could get better candidates that met better the requirements we were looking for. And that's because the evolution is kind of happening, you know, everywhere. Everyone is having similar problems and figuring out how to fix those things. And so everything is evolving kind of slowly into the same direction. And so it just made it easier for us to kind of like find the right people for the right roles. And like I said before, it was just to really call attention to what is the core intent behind the role, and who do we want that role to be seen as part of a conversation. And for us, just having all the roles be designer related just really helped with that mindset within the company. But I would say if a company doesn't have some of these problems and they're really happy with the way that they've broken things down, they shouldn't just feel the need to like change it just because they want to change it. Some companies even try to take things that have been standardized, like the Scrum and Agile roles, and make very unique things out of them. Bungie's even doing this, like we're taking a product owner role and calling it a feature lead. And I know Spotify has like made terms that no one could understand except the people that work at Spotify. And sometimes that's to create their own culture. And so maybe it would be bad if we would just all kind of use the same, because every studio wants to have their own kind of personality, but it certainly helps recruiting for sure.
Yeah, I mean, for someone who does my job as a technical designer, if they see, UI artists, they're like, oh, that's a graphic design thing or whatever, and they're not even going to click on the link and see that we want you to know how to script, and you get to do all this fun, exciting technical work, and so we probably have missed out on a bunch of really great candidates because they didn't even click on the link to read it because of the title. So this makes it much better.
And something early on as UI design, it was confusing as to what I was supposed to deliver. And I think that was true across all the disciplines of like, what is my core that we can kind of like rely on and understand? And so like, was I supposed to develop art, like high fidelity, or is it okay that it's just wireframes? Like, what is my general, how do I fit in the team? Became a lot clearer when we switched to those exact roles, whereas before it was like, well, you do a little of everything, don't you? It's like, that's impossible. Like we were saying, it's impossible to pull it off effectively. Usually you do end up going somewhere anyways, and you just become really weak in other areas. Now we're defining like, yes, this is your core strength. You have this other secondary strength. Maybe you even have a third, but you can prioritize those, and the team knows where to rely on those strengths at certain times in the project. That helps a lot.
Jami, make the icons, and I'm like, you. And they're like, no, I'm serious.
Thanks, guys.
So we have about a minute for each person now, so
sorry.
we'll be punctual.
We talk too much.
I'll try and keep this short then. I guess I want to go back to what you guys started off with, of the problem of too many cooks, and how I've been on teams that, I've worked on teams that are 3 people to 30 people, and that's the kind of scale that I've gone through in my career. What are the warning signs that you guys can see early of there being too many cooks? Is it more on a higher level of directors, because UI is so fundamentally to the point of everyone has an opinion on it because it's super visual, and people are like, well, I use my phone and it does this, so therefore it should do that, right? So what are the warning signs for you to kind of nullify that too many cook problem that you guys can have?
Sad producers.
Yeah. I don't know. My teams have always been too small. Even at Bungie, our team's too small.
What size is your team at Bungie? Out of curiosity.
It's about 25 people in total,
Right.
and out of that, I would say a half of that is the designer roles, and then we have the QA, producers, engineers. Yeah. And then those get split up into 3 different agile small teams.
Okay.
I think it's mostly working through features and understanding like there's a certain point where you don't have the right velocity. And again, that comes down to production kind of being like, and then everyone's like, yeah, that's a little bit rough right now.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
We're gonna make it. I know
Hello.
it.
Well, we'll see. You mentioned one of your next steps in maturity for UI UX is to join those strategic discussions, and talked a little bit in the working with product side about how, but I'd be interested in more of how you all see that happening at Bungie or in the industry, because that's a question that comes up in these disciplines everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that at Bungie, the indication that something like that can happen is our Agile lead. So that is a person that joined the company when we decided to become Agile, and was just kind of like a consultant, and would always like try to be booked into meetings, and people were like, oh no, it's not really related to you, we don't need you, and then just were persistent and kept fighting for proving their worth in those conversations, and is now actually part of that group and is leading that group. So it can happen. It's just a matter of kind of like showing people that UX is its own thing that really benefits from knowing what the high-level business strategy is. Because a lot of times people don't see it that way, because they just know that if they figure those things out and then send all these like well-defined solutions, we will just kind of like make the pretty pictures. So we just have to keep kind of like working at it, showing our worth, showing how we approach problem solving through strategy, and I think it'll just happen eventually. I'm hopeful.
Similar to any role, it's building relationships with people.
We're slowly turning people to our way, one person at a time, and eventually we'll get critical mass and win.
Cool, thank you. Last question.
Yeah, my question was kind of similar. I loved the way that you guys were talking about player experience and customer experience, and similarly in like other industries, you see that kind of bubble up into things like brand experience. What are your kind of thoughts on applying things like lean UX at like companies the size of, say, Bungie, where you do have that kind of product team where that UX is kind of there at the beginning saying, you know, like gaming's not just about play anymore, it's about like watching on Twitch and those kind of things. Like,
Yeah, I think if we band up with our agility lead and try to like, you know, have that be part of the next evolution. Like right now, Bungie is kind of figuring out, everyone goes and does Scrum by the book, kind of like the first 2 years. And then they start like looking around and seeing what other methodologies are available. Like, you know, now they're talking about scaled agile. I think lean might be really good, and UX lean is something that, you know, certainly would work for our org. And so that's the, at least the good part is we can do some changes on our side and just prove that to the studio. So whatever we try and it seems to be working, people will usually kind of like bubble that up and say, hey, you know, there's something over here that's, you know, doing well, and KPIs are indicating that it is good. Maybe we should do it elsewhere. So that's kind of our mantra, is to just try to show others how to do it, what good looks like, and then just go from there.
cool, thanks.
Awesome, thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks.
Thanks.